Michigan has produced its fair share of NFL quarterbacks, none as well known as 7-time Super Bowl champion Tom Brady. Chad Henne also won 2 Super Bowls himself as the backup to Patrick Mahomes, and Brian Griese won a ring backing up John Elway. Todd Collins had a long pro career, as did Jim Harbaugh, who recruited and developed the next great Michigan quarterback, J.J. McCarthy. McCarthy led the Wolverines to their first consensus national championship since 1948 and finished his collegiate career 27-1 as a starter. There is, without a doubt, an argument that he is the greatest quarterback in Michigan history, and maybe the most interesting too. He meditates before each game to clear his mind, brushes his teeth with his left hand because it makes you have alpha brainwaves, and tells himself, "I love you, man," while visualizing himself. J.J. McCarthy is certainly different, but it's worked for him. His odd habits helped him out of a depression and turned him into a top quarterback prospect. J.J. McCarthy was born on January 20th, 2003 in LaGrange Park, Illinois, where he'd later attend Nazareth Academy for high school. In 8th grade, he had already received a scholarship offer from Iowa State. At Nazareth, McCarthy reached the Class 7A state title game in all 3 seasons he was there. Starting as a sophomore, Nazareth went 13-1 and won the state title behind 3,448 yards and 39 touchdowns from McCarthy. He followed it up with 2,820 yards and 34 touchdowns as a junior. When McCarthy was a senior, Nazareth had their football season canceled because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, J.J. McCarthy decided to transfer to IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida. McCarthy then passed for 1,392 yards and 16 touchdowns without an interception. He led IMG to an 8-0 record and a consensus national championship. McCarthy was a composite 5-star recruit and the 5th best quarterback in the 2021 class, 3 spots behind Caleb Williams and 4 behind Quinn Ewers, the overall top recruit in the country. Believe it or not, J.J. McCarthy grew up as an Ohio State fan while watching Terrell Pryor and Braxton Miller. His opinion on the Buckeyes changed pretty fast. In 2019, McCarthy said, "I used to love them. Now I want to kill them." McCarthy visited Columbus in March, and head coach Ryan Day told him he wasn't going to take a quarterback in the 2021 class until the end of the summer. Then on April 30th, Pennsylvania 4-star Kyle McCord committed to Ohio State. McCarthy said he got that it's a business, but it sucked being lied to. And that's where the rivalry started for him. Who knows if Ryan Day lied or not? What matters is that Michigan head coach Jim Harbaugh got a guy that felt like he was wronged by Ohio State. Michigan had lost 8 straight to Ohio State before McCarthy enrolled in Ann Arbor. Michigan broke the losing streak in 2021 with McCarthy on the bench, and then he won both times he started in the game. McCarthy got the last laugh and helped flip the script in the rivalry. Meanwhile, Kyle McCord transferred to Syracuse after his first season as the Buckeyes starter. The last game of his tenure at Ohio State was a loss to Michigan and J.J. McCarthy. There are some noticeable similarities between J.J. McCarthy and the great Tom Brady. And like Brady did, McCarthy had to wait his turn at Michigan. J.J. McCarthy spent his entire true freshman year as the backup to Cade McNamara. McNamara himself had to wait his turn, backing up Shea Patterson in 2019 and Joe Milton in 2020 before he started the Wolverines' last of 6 games. McNamara then started in all 14 games games for Michigan in 2021, going 12-2 and losing in the college football playoff semifinal to Georgia. McNamara threw only 4 interceptions all season before throwing 2 against Georgia, causing him to get benched for J.J. McCarthy. McCarthy appeared in 11 games all season, throwing for 516 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. J.J. McCarthy and Cade McNamara had to compete against each other for the Michigan starting job in 2022. It was so close, Jim Harbaugh had to continue it for the first 2 games of the season, with each of them starting a game. McNamara started in week 1 against Colorado State and never started again at Michigan. The next week, McCarthy threw for 229 yards and 3 touchdowns versus Hawaii and started the rest of the year. McNamara transferred to Iowa following the regular season. In week 3, McCarthy passed for 214 yards against UConn to close out non-conference play 3-0. Over the next 3 weeks, McCarthy passed for 679 yards and 6 touchdowns to a single interception. That led up to, at that point, the biggest test of the year for the Wolverines, number 10 Penn State. McCarthy didn't have a great outing with 145 yards and an interception, but Michigan dominated on the ground in a 41-17 blowout win. McCarthy rushed for 57 yards, and Donovan Edwards and Blake Corum combined for 339 yards and 4 touchdowns. Michigan entered their bye week 7-0, 4-0 in the Big Ten, and controlled their own destiny. They then won 4 straight against unranked opponents, with McCarthy throwing for 655 yards and 5 touchdowns and rushing for 2 touchdowns along the way. That set up the biggest game of the season thus far, the game at the Shoe. Michigan was without their star running back Blake Corum for almost the entire game in what was his last of the season. But it didn't matter. McCarthy came up big when it mattered most, passing for 263 yards and 3 touchdowns and rushing for another. Meanwhile, Heisman hopeful CJ Stroud had 349 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions to finish 0-2 against Michigan in his collegiate career after the 45-23 loss. So, Michigan won the Big Ten East for the 2nd straight season to return to the Big Ten championship game to play Purdue. Michigan led by a single point at the half, but ultimately won 43-22 behind 161 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception from J.J. McCarthy. He was an integral part to the Wolverines' success in 2022. He passed for 2,719 yards, 22 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions, and rushed for 5 touchdowns. Meanwhile, number 2 Michigan found itself in the same spot as the year prior, in the college football playoff semifinal, and it ended the same way, with a loss. The Wolverines faced number 3 TCU with Heisman runner-up Max Duggan, who went on to throw for 225 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, and rushed for 57 yards and 2 touchdowns. McCarthy had a similar day as self, throwing for 343 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, and rushing for 52 yards and a touchdown. Michigan lost 51-45, but it was uglier than that. The Horned Frogs raced out to a 21-3 lead and led by as much as 19 points late in the 3rd quarter. The Wolverines were a 7.5-point favorite. Instead, Jim Harbaugh dropped to 1-6 in bowl games at Michigan. Harbaugh was hired in 2015 and won the Citrus Bowl that season over Florida to finish 10-3. Outside of the 2020 COVID year, Michigan qualified for a bowl game each season, but kept losing and continued losing to Ohio State. That was until 2021. Harbaugh got the monkey off his back and beat the Buckeyes, and did again the next season once J.J. McCarthy became the starter, but lost in the college football semifinal both years. There were a lot of questions surrounding Harbaugh and if he could win it all. Violating recruiting regulations and a sign-stealing scandal aside, he was on the cusp of proving everyone wrong, and McCarthy was going to help. Michigan started the 2023 season off with a 3-0 start in non-conference play. After McCarthy passed for 558 yards and 5 touchdowns over the first 2 wins, he then had the worst game of his collegiate career against Bowling Green. Michigan still won 31-6 with ease, but McCarthy struggled, throwing 3 interceptions to go with 143 yards and 2 touchdowns. It was a stinker. For the rest of the year, he threw just 1 interception. The Wolverines started rolling fast. Michigan's closest game through their first 6 Big Ten games was a 31-7 win over Rutgers, and that was the only game over the stretch where they didn't score over 40 points. McCarthy went for 1,433 yards and 11 touchdowns, plus 3 touchdowns on the ground. Number 2 Michigan was 9-0, but had to take a visit to Happy Valley to face number 10 Penn State, and it would have to come without Jim Harbaugh, who was suspended for 3 games by the Big Ten. Blake Corum broke out the Michigan vs. Everybody merch, and the Wolverines got a needed 24-15 win, but McCarthy didn't throw much. Michigan ran the ball 32 straight times, and JJ McCarthy threw the ball just 8 times all game for 60 yards, but also rushed for 34 yards. It wasn't pretty, but Michigan controlled the game and earned a hard-fought win, and they'd have to escape the next week at Maryland. McCarthy had 141 yards and an interception in another underwhelming performance. Michigan went up 23-3, but were only up 5 headed into the 4th quarter before winning 31-24. Once again, the script was set. Number 3 Michigan would have to go through number 2 Ohio State in the game to advance to the Big Ten championship game, but this time it was back at the Big House. It was by every measure a dogfight between 2 of the best defenses in the country. JJ McCarthy had a fair outing with 148 yards and a touchdown that put the Wolverines up 14-3 early in the 2nd quarter, but the Buckeyes kept fighting. Ohio State got the ball back with 1 minute remaining and 81 yards to go without timeouts before Kyle McCord was picked off by Rod Moore, securing a Michigan win and another Big Ten championship game appearance. The Wolverines had little problem with Iowa and their non-existent offense in the title game and won 26-0 as McCarthy had 147 yards passing. After number 8 Alabama upset number 1 Georgia in the SEC championship game, it was clear that Michigan was going to be number 1 in the college football playoff, but that came with the tall task of having to face the Crimson Tide themselves. Looking back, that game really felt like the national championship game, but it wasn't. It was the semifinal, and it was an instant classic. Not to mention, it was the final game of the Nick Saban era before his surprise retirement. It was a dogfight the whole way. Michigan took a 3-point lead into the half ahead of a scoreless 3rd quarter. In the 4th, Bama scored 10 unanswered to go up 7. Michigan had to respond and did just that. McCarthy led a 75-yard drive and capped it off with his 3rd touchdown pass of the game, a 4-yard touchdown strike to Roman Wilson to tie the game with 1:34 remaining. That ultimately forced overtime, where it took 2 plays for Blake Corum to find the back of the end zone. It then took 2 plays for Alabama to get into a goal-to-go situation, but the Michigan defense made a stand. On 4th and goal, Jalen Milroe ran straight into a wall. Michigan won 27-20 to make the national championship game for the first time. The last time Michigan had won a national championship, the Bowl Alliance was in place and the Wolverines weren't even a consensus champion. They were ranked 1st in the final AP poll, but 2nd in the final coaches poll behind Nebraska. Years after the Bowl Alliance and even the BCS system, Michigan had a chance to prove they were without a doubt the best team in the country, and they did just that, beating number 2 Washington 34-13. McCarthy threw for 140 yards, and Blake Corum stole the show with 134 yards and 2 touchdowns. Michael Penix and his stud wide receivers just couldn't get going against a really good Michigan defense. Michigan did it. Jim Harbaugh did it. J.J. McCarthy did it. The doubters had been silenced, but it was time to move on. Harbaugh took the Chargers head coach job, and offensive coordinator Sharon Moore took over. Meanwhile, McCarthy decided to declare for the 2024 NFL Draft after his junior year, where he passed for 2,991 yards, 22 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, and rushed for 3 touchdowns. After Michigan beat Alabama in the Rose Bowl, Jim Harbaugh said J.J. McCarthy is the greatest quarterback in Michigan history, and it's hard to argue against that. Even Tom Brady agreed, and how could you not? He went 27-1 over his 2 seasons starting, went undefeated against Ohio State, and is the program career leader in completion percentage. The reality is, regardless of where J.J. McCarthy gets drafted or what he does at the next level, he is forever a Michigan legend.